we'll just start, and hopefully during the course of the class we can work out the projector situation. And first things, well, everyone doing stuff for credit, meet with me at the end of class. That way we don't waste everyone's time talking about your papers. So anyone who wants credit, make sure you stay at the end of class and we'll have a conversation about that. And then, so yesterday we did last week we just did a quick crash course on logic. Now I tried a more convenient way for me of recording the lecture, and it turned out to be terrible. The quality is not good. It wasn't able to get the whole video. I uploaded everything I was able to get anyways to my YouTube page, so for those of you that are new, you can go there and watch like the first 40 minutes of the lecture. In the description, I also link you to another lecture of mine which covers the same material but at a faster pace. So if you watch the 40 minutes I did have recorded, and then watch that next video which covers the same material again but at a faster pace, you might be able to keep up with the later video and that way get everything. But it's just a quick crash course through logic. For those of you who that was your first time going through logic and you thought, wow, this is pretty intense, nothing we do for the rest of this class will be near that intense. So this class will not be near that difficult again. That's just get you comfortable with the notation somewhat. Basically throw you into the deep end, that way when we're walking in shallow water, there's nothing to panic you type stuff. So today what we're going to focus on is, well, I have no clue how far we're going to get. I just have like a big massive slideshow that we're just going to run through, and I have no clue, no feel for how fast we're going to cover the material because never taught this before. But two things I did want to talk about before we start the material. One was to give all of you a pretty big disclaimer. So for those of you that don't know me, my majors were math and computer science in college. This is history of Western philosophy. I did not major in history. I did not major in philosophy. I have taken one college philosophy course called Introduction to Philosophy, and I wasn't impressed with it. I didn't think it was a great course. I don't feel like I learned a lot in that course, is probably the best way to say that. And then as far as history classes I've taken, for those of you at the academy, you've had almost everything I've had. I also did an American history class in college. So that's all my formal philosophy education and all my formal history education. Outside of that, I just kind of read stuff for hobbies. So like I enjoy Plato and Aristotle, so I know them pretty well. And there's time periods of history that I know pretty well just from reading the actual works of people. But I've never been formally educated on the material, and it is so easy. I discovered when I was actually studying math, it was so easy for me to think I understood a concept, and then when talking about it with someone who, this is what they do, they're able to tweak your understanding and make you realize, no, you didn't quite have it, you didn't quite have it. So I don't have anyone doing that for me when it comes to presenting this material. What is happening? I'm reading the material, trying the best to understand it, and then just explaining it to you. That's all that's happening. I don't have any magical insight that you couldn't have by just reading the material. There's nothing special. I don't just know this material. I have no clue what I'm going to be teaching 3 weeks down the road. I don't have the presentation built out yet. So, this is new material for me. You need to be critical of me presenting the material. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right. So, I will try to make sure that you know all the materials that I'm going to be referencing so that you can, to your heart's content, check it yourself. There's going to be some places where I intentionally go different from the author. Definitely read the textbook. I mean, this guy, when they write a textbook, they put so much thought into that textbook and make sure that they give you all the crucial stuff and present it in an organized way. Here I am, reading stuff off the slides, presenting on the fly. I'm not going to do near as good a job as your author. Now, one thing that I will try to do, specifically with the book, is when we get to points where things could go either way, where there's two major interpretations. So first one we'll come across this way is Pythagoras. Pythagoras, there's two major different ways you can talk about his life. When it comes to major splits like that, I will try to always do the one that the author doesn't do. That way between me and the author, hopefully you get both sides of it and can better make a judgment yourself. So that's my big disclaimer. I am not professional in this material. I'm just teaching it because you guys wanted it. That's why, literally. Okay, second little piece of this is more just advice, in looking at philosophical arguments, I want to introduce you to something that happens a lot just in the field of physics. I happen to know physics pretty well, so that's the field I'll talk about. In physics, it's very often that we come up with some model for how the universe works, and we find out it's not quite right. So we tweak the model and make it more complicated to correct for errors. And as our instruments of measurement get a little bit better, we find out it's not quite right. So we tweak it again, and the model just becomes more and more and more convoluted until you have a big, messy model. And then someone has a breakthrough with a much cleaner way of thinking about it, and we continue on. Give you one example. Everyone familiar with Copernicus? What did Copernicus do? Okay, Copernicus is the one that made the argument that the sun is at the center of our solar system, and the Earth goes around the sun while spinning. So it spins for night and day, and years are the Earth going around the sun. Prior to Copernicus, most people thought that the Earth was at the center of the universe, or solar system, and that the sun went around the Earth every 24 hours. He says, no, the Earth is spinning, and on top of that, it's going around, but it takes a year for it to go around. So he's the one that had that insight. And all the models of planet motion, including Copernicus and back, were using circles. So Copernicus, with his model, you had the Earth goes around the sun in a circle, and Mercury goes around the sun in a circle, and Venus goes around the sun in a circle, etc. I know I didn't draw circles, but it's what they're supposed to be. So that was a great model when Copernicus first introduced it, and then as our devices for measuring got more and more and more precise, we found out that doesn't quite work. So what was the big idea that people had to make it start working? They said, the Earth isn't just going around the sun in a circle, but it's moving in a circle while it's going in this circle. What do we mean by that? I mean the Earth is going in circles like this while it goes in this big circle. Maybe that's what's happening. So its motion would look something like this. Well, maybe something like that. And when they did that, that looked like it corrected for error. Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much. That is a load off my back. See ya. Wonderful. We got a projector. Maybe I'll keep talking about this and you'll have to just wait for me to set up. So then they decided maybe it's going in circles while it does it, and they found ingenious ways to talk about how it's going in circles to make it suddenly match up with what we see, what our observations are. And that worked for a while, but our observations got better, and it turns out that wasn't quite right. So what was the big breakthrough they had? Maybe it's going in circles while it's going in circles while it's going in circles. And it continued like this big convoluted model till no one could even do the mathematics to check anymore if it matched up with observations. It was absurd. And then Kepler finally comes along and says, guys, it's not a circle, it's just an ellipse. And that worked great. And then it continues on. The story goes on from Kepler to Newton to Einstein. So that's what you're going to often notice with these philosophical arguments. There's going to be arguments that one philosopher puts forward, and then later in time someone finds issue with it. And so it's like it gets reworked, and then it becomes more and more convoluted, this model of the universe that they're building up, to the point where it's harder to understand the model than to even check if it works. So that's my own personal feeling about a lot of these arguments that we're going to come across. The second one I want to warn you about, this is the one that worked pretty good for the kids, so hopefully it works for you guys as well. Is there anyone in here who hasn't done an algebra course? Okay, I'm going to give you a nice algebra problem. -1 is equal to -1 to the power of 1, right? Which is equal to -1 to the power of 2 halves, right? 2 halves, that's just 1. Which is equal to, and you know what, you can split your exponents up, so that's going to be -1/2 squared to the 1/2, right? When you have exponents to exponents, that's the same as multiplying them, which you can rewrite that way. That's perfectly fine. And then, do you know what the 1/2 is? Square root. You remember that? So this is the same thing as the square root of -1 squared, which is equal to the square root of 1. When you square -1, right? -1 times -1 is 1. And what's the square root of 1? It's 1. So -1 equals 1. this is a bad argument. This is very false. Don't be taken in for half a second. Now, you're also going to come across arguments like this. You're going to come across arguments where piece by piece you can follow the argument, and yeah, it's kind of seemed like it made sense, but then the conclusion just feels absolutely absurd. If the conclusion feels absolutely absurd, my own personal advice, reject the argument. Okay? So, hopefully, that is one tricky enough that a lot of you are confused right now and wondering how on earth was algebra just a lie? No, algebra wasn't a lie. I cheated, and I deliberately cheated in a way that I knew would confuse you because I know the math very well. And you have dedicated years of your life to studying algebra. What is it, typically 3 years? Where you take an algebra course? 3 years where you take an algebra course, and this argument is causing you to stumble. And now we're going to be talking about people who are dead and gone in a few 10, 15 minutes giving you their arguments. You have had way more exposure to this argument and understanding this argument than you will have to any of the arguments that we take in this philosophy course. So just because an argument seems convincing and comes to some absurd just because it seems convincing, let's just say that, doesn't magically make it true. So don't suddenly change your whole worldview because one argument comes along, it just seems persuasive. Those are my 2 warnings. Okay, any questions so far? Good? All right, so that was my warning. Now we're ready to jump in as soon as I get the projector set up. Should have made one of you who already knew where I was going with that set it up. That wasn't smart.
Donnie, do you know who Gad Saad is?
Gad Saad. How do you spell that?
G-A-D-S-A-A-D.
S-A-A-D. It's not ringing a bell. What does he do?
He is I think he majors in biology. But
Oh, he's currently living?
yeah.
Okay, yeah, then I for sure don't know him.
What's interesting is he has this book, and it's about infectious ideas, and he takes on the left. And he shows people where you have this innocent argument that people make, and then someone just comes along and then starts like parasites. They call it the parasite idea, and they tweak that little argument, that innocent argument, and then it goes off into massive parasites, and it's quite interesting. He's a great friend of Jordan Peterson, and I ran into him on a podcast.
It's interesting.
Kind of reminds me of Socrates convincing people that they're wrong or showing that they're wrong.
Sorry, from here on out, this will be set up when you guys show up and we'll be ready to go. I came early. I just wasn't able to get set up.
So Donnie, did you guys already talk about what's the foundation of philosophy? What's the point of philosophy? Why does it exist? What are they searching for?
So we'll get into that a little bit. The foundation of philosophy in the sense of what does philosophy presuppose? Well, the problem is everything's philosophy, so now you're getting my philosophy on philosophy is what some meticulous philosopher would say. But that's all I can give you. So the foundations of philosophy are logic. In philosophy, you inductively reason to your premises based on common experience, and then you apply logic to derive conclusions. So give you a taste of the difference. And I'm using it in the modern sense of the word now. So I'll give you 3 arguments and that are completely different fields. Einstein's general theory of relativity, that's obviously a scientific argument. The Pythagorean theorem, that's mathematics. Humans have inalienable rights, that's philosophy. With me so far?
Yeah.
Now, there's no such thing as a scientific proof that humans have rights. You can't do it. There's no such thing as a philosophical proof, even that the earth goes around the sun. If you were to go tell a philosopher, I know that the earth goes around the sun, they're going to say, how on earth do you know that? Because someone told you? How does that make you know? That's why philosophical arguments have to start with common experience. They can only presuppose common experience that everyone has had. You can use the fact that, yeah, you see the earth go around the sun in your argument. Okay, that's fine. You can't say, well, if you meticulously start charting all these stars and go look at Kepler's arguments and all his geometry, you come to this conclusion. That's not an experience people have as a general rule. So philosophical arguments, you inductively reason on common experience to your premises and then determine their logical implications. In science, you inductively reason on quantifiable, observable phenomena and then apply logic to come to your conclusions. And since science has that second qualification of it has to be quantifiable, then science has the wonderful luxury of they can use math now for everything. To every observation, they can assign numbers. Since they can assign numbers, they can assign mathematical models. And so not only can they use logic to come to conclusions, but they can actually use any mathematical structure we've constructed to come to conclusions. Logic doesn't have, or philosophy doesn't have that luxury, so they have to fall back on brute force, just logic. And for those of you who were there when we built like set theory from logic, you can see how tedious it would be if we just tried doing all our science with just logic, how much logic it takes to talk about very simple mathematical structures. Even if I ask you for like the set theory definition of 92, what is it? The set containing 91, 90, 89, 88, 80, and yeah, and then you need to write out each of those sets, and geez, to write it out would probably take us a day. So, being limited to logic, it's a huge limitation, but the great part about it is since you're only reasoning on common experience, all your conclusions are universally applicable. They're applicable to everyone. And then we'll get into a little bit of evolution of the actual word here in a second. There's got to be some way. It's on the back. You'll lower the back instead of raising the front.
There's one in the middle.
There's
One.
in front.
Ah, thank you.
Usually.
Yeah, that is exactly what I was looking for. Are those lights set so we can turn off like a front row? The back on? Okay. Is everyone okay with us using that for the lighting? You want the blinds closed? If it helps you, you can try it.
Yes, please.
Actually, yeah, they're shining on that back row pretty bad. For you two. That's crooked. Probably because I messed with the back. Well, we'll deal with crooked for one class. We'll fix it in the future. Okay. So yeah, from here on out, I'll just have slides of presentations that we can use to present everything. So, history of Western philosophy, that's what the course is going to be about. Hopefully that shows it pretty well on the phone. Now, the actual word philosophy comes from Philein and Sophia. So if you have Philein for Sophia, then you have a love of wisdom. Now, initially when philosophy comes into being, so the first philosopher we're going to be talking about, his name is Thales. He's considered the father of philosophy, but he's also considered the father of science, and he's also considered the father of mathematics. So when philosophy first comes into being, in the way that the early on ancient Greeks are going to talk about philosophy, is basically any body of knowledge. So we're going to be talking about mathematicians, scientists, historians. If you were in anything in the ancient times, you were a philosopher. So it starts out any body of knowledge, and then it slowly has been it's been worked down to what it is today. The way that some modern philosophers would tell you what philosophy is they would say, we have a field of knowledge, and when we don't really know how to work with it, it's in philosophy. Once we come up with a nice structure for it, then it breaks off from philosophy. So they would probably say something like, mathematics broke off from philosophy with Euclid. For those of you who are familiar with the elements, once we decided to start using postulates and axioms and determine their logical implications. And they'd say that physics probably broke off with Galileo and etc. And the first philosophers that we're going to be talking about, Aristotle actually calls them physikoi, which is where the word physics comes from. Physikoi meaning they're physicists, because what they were very much interested in is what later we call natural philosophy or science. So, covered that. Okay. Now, so what is philosophy today? Kind of. I'll explain the kind of in a second. But so today, there's considered to be three major branches of philosophy. So you have metaphysics, which examines the fundamental nature of reality. So this is going beyond just physics. So this would be questions like, is there something outside our universe? Is there just physical and material things, or is there something like a soul? Questions about, what am I looking for? Free will, agency, that's a metaphysical question. Is there such thing as free will, making choice, or is everything deterministic or fatalistic? So that's metaphysics, good with that one. Next major field is called epistemology. This examines the nature and means of human knowledge. So what can humans know and how do they come to know it? Good with that one? Mm-hmm. And then the third major branch is this thing right here, axology. Axology is basically concerned with value judgments. Any branch that you have to make value judgments rather than just describing the way that things are comes under axology. Its three major branches are ethics, politics, and aesthetics. Now, well, I'll say that once we get down there. So, moving on to ethics. What's ethics? Ethics defines and examines a code of values to guide individual human action. The way I think about it in my head is the morality of the individual. Now, in case there's anyone in here who understands the background behind those two words, they might take issue with this. Ethics initially came to mean someone's character. Morality came to mean their customs. So, are you courageous would be an ethical question. And, I don't know, human sacrifice would be a morality question. Custom versus character. That used to be a major distinction. I am not going to use that distinction. I'm going to use them basically interchangeable. And I'm going to use moral and ethical almost the exact same way. But just some history on the words, I guess. So, ethics, we're looking at the morality of the individual. Politics examines the proper nature of society, in particular the proper function of government. And here I just think about it in terms of morality of the state. Any question on those two? So these four will be the big ones that we cover in ancient times. And then we'll occasionally touch on this fifth one every now and then, which is why I have these five listed out and not these other ones. Number 5, aesthetics. Aesthetics examines the nature of beauty and the standard by which it is to be evaluated. So this would be evaluating pieces of art, evaluating some composed music. Stuff like that would fall under aesthetics. So now you can kind of understand how these three things kind of depends on your values for how you determine what's true or false there, which is why all this is now grouped together under axology. So 3 major branches: metaphysics, epistemology, axology. Now there's 100 subfields that you could list out as well that are all considered part of philosophy. Logic, this isn't just, for those of you who have done logic, this isn't just propositional and predicate logic, but it gets into like modal logic where you're looking at the necessary operator and the probable operator. So less certain fields of logic. When you talk about rigorous logic, the way that we typically think about it, that's now pretty much considered mathematics. But then religion, language, and there's a bunch of things I didn't see any value in trying to list out a whole bunch of them. So that's roughly what philosophy is today. If If you ask 100 philosophers for a definition of philosophy, you get 100 different answers. So any questions about big picture philosophy before we get into the history?
So why is religion not under metaphysics?
Why is religion not every metaphysical question is a religious question? The premises of your religion could be metaphysical.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I see that.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, so let's jump now into the history, and I'm going to try and give you a historical context. What we're going to do here is we're going to do a quick crash course on world history leading up to Thales, who's around 600 BC, focusing around the Mediterranean. So first off, hopefully you've seen this thing before, right? And civilization starts becoming big in 4 major places. Along the Yellow River over in Asia somewhere, along the Indus River, the Indus Valley people in India, along the Nile River over here in Egypt, and then between the Tigris and Euphrates River over here in the Middle East. We'll be interested in the latter two. So we're interested in Egypt, we're interested in what's going on in Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates River. We don't really care too much about China and India, and we don't look anything at North and South America. So we're going to be focusing on this area, and hopefully you all know what this body of water is called. The Mediterranean Sea. We know what that one is. The Black Sea. Impress me.
No.
Caspian Sea. Yeah. Caspian Sea, the only reason that's a good one to know is because this land over here, the Caucasus, is where a lot of people are often from. We often talk about Caucasian people coming from the Caucasus.
So Donnie, the reason we're focusing on the Middle East area, Mesopotamia area, whatever, is because that's Western.
Yes, this is Western. Well, we call this the Middle East, but it has huge impacts on Western thought because, where we're really going to be talking about the most is this peninsula right here, Greece. That's where Greece is. And this is where this area, you'll understand why I can't say just Greece, but this area, these Greeks, are the first peoples that we're interested in. And the massive existing civilizations at the time that are going to have major influences on them are Mesopotamia and Egypt. So that's why we're going to really quick rush through what's going on in these areas. It makes sense how they had an effect on when Thales comes to scene in Pythagoras. So zooming in on the Mediterranean. Now, so I want to quickly talk about what the history of Mesopotamia and the history of Egypt. We'll do Egypt first because it's a lot easier. Egypt, pretty straightforward. Egypt has always been Egypt and always will be Egypt, is the way that the ancients saw it. It was one of the first ones to come around. It was very stable. This up here is called Lower Egypt. This up here is called Upper Egypt because the Nile flows this way. They became united together around 3000 to 3500 BC. Not sure exactly when. But since they've been united, then this land right here has pretty much been one political unit all the way through almost all the time that we're going to talk about in this class. So you can almost think this is them at their peak, but this part of them, something like that, right here, is pretty much one stable political unit for all time. They have their ups and downs, but Egypt can roughly be broken up into 3 major periods. We have the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. The Old Kingdom, that's when the Great Pyramids were formed. Middle Kingdom, nothing too spectacular. The New Kingdom is what you're seeing right here when Egypt is at its max. So this is as big as Egypt ever becomes. This is them at their political max. And so what happens in these places where peoples become very united is, well, first off, let's talk about why civilization kickstarted around Egypt so well. The reason it kickstarts so well around Egypt is this river, the Nile, is a wonderful river to be around. So humans are out hunter-gatherers, then they started agriculture, growing your own food supply. And the Nile floods annually in a very predictable way, leaving very fertile soil along the side, especially up in the delta. And so planting food there is just as easy as can be. You chuck the seeds, it lands, and it just sprouts up. It's amazing. Super easy life for them as far as obtaining food. Once your food needs are met, then what?
Trade.
Then you have trade, but then you just start developing other ways. People get into specific trades, and you start having different castes develop. In particular, you'll notice that anywhere civilization starts, pretty quickly you have something equivalent to a priest class. And the priest class is able to pretty much live a life of luxury. They don't have to work for a living. And so when you don't have to work for a living, your mind's free to wander, start thinking about other things, come up with clever schemes. And so the Egypts, Aristotle's going to tell us that the Egyptians are the first ones who start mathematics. Now this is not mathematics as in we start with, for those of you who understand axioms to determine their logical implications, they just started finding neat tips and tricks for doing mathematical calculations. So for example, they were very good at figuring out how to calculate areas of certain land because that's what their tax system was based on. So they had a bunch of nice tricks for calculating areas. But it wasn't abstract in their minds. There was no concept of just because it works for calculating area here, I can also use it for calculating area here. It was very empirical. They just discovered little mathematical facts. But the other thing, since they were so stable, is all their discoveries were preserved. So they had written language, they would write on their structures, and that information was preserved from generation to generation. And so in Egypt, you just have a massive encyclopedia of information being slowly built up. Now only the priest class knows about it, they're the ones developing it, and they're the ones maintaining it. But that is going to be very crucial for later thinkers, for Greeks, when they're able to come to Egypt and they're able to get exposed to this body of knowledge. And so if you're wondering, why are they going to Egypt to get this body of knowledge? Why do the Egyptians have all this encyclopedic information? It's because Egypt has always been and always will be just Egypt in their minds. It's been around forever. It's very well recorded. It's going to last forever. Look at the pyramids. So that's a quick run through of Egypt. Any questions there before we go to the Middle East? All right. So now we're looking to the right of the Mediterranean Sea. So Egypt's still down here. To the right, civilization developed around these two. It probably doesn't look like two because they followed all the offshoots. But I think the major parts are right here. The Tigris and Euphrates River. Tigris is the top one. Euphrates is the bottom one. So once again, agriculture develops around here just like it does around Egypt. But there's a huge difference between these rivers and the Nile. These are not nice rivers. They are not predictable at all. And so it could be that 10 years go by where they're pretty stable, and then 1 year, just a massive flood comes along and destroys all your infrastructure along the rivers. And so you can actually see a good contrast between how they thought about religion in terms of this. So the Egyptian gods are very kind, beneficent, loving gods who take care of you. And if you look at the gods that these guys worship, they're very fickle gods. They're not gods that you say, thank you for the blessings. They're gods that you say, please don't curse me today, and I'll give you a bowl. So, very fickle gods over here, and that's because these rivers are very fickle. And so it's very often that things are going great, and then suddenly they're going terrible. Egypt, it's always been great. And so it takes much, much, much later in history for this Mesopotamia region to finally become politically united under one system. Now there were some major cities that got powerful in the region. For example, we all know Babylon. That's always been a pretty powerful city for, by the time we're talking about, this is the Assyrians, so we're at 824 to 671. Babylon's been a pretty stable city for a few thousand years at this point, Nineveh. So there have been strong cities that have able to kind of do what Egypt does, but just not in the same degree that Egypt has been able to do it. So the cities have been fairly stable, but not united, not all of them being united together because of how divided up their land is. So early on, they're more like separate city-states, kind of like the Greeks were, and it's not until the Assyrians come along that they finally become united. So the Assyrian Empire, you see it, here's what it was at 824 BC, and then 671 BC is when you see them at their max. And eventually they end up conquering Egypt. When they conquer Egypt, once again, it's not piece by piece they conquer Egypt. It's either you don't have Egypt or you have all of Egypt. It's a very stable political system, so once you get the head, you've got all of Egypt. So even though Egypt is under the Assyrians, they're still functioning the way that Egypt almost always has. It's just now the pharaoh has to pay some taxes to the head of the Assyrian Empire. To help make a tie-in, for those of you who know some biblical history, you'll notice the kingdom of Judah there with Jerusalem as its capital, and you'll see that's yellow. It wasn't conquered. So Israel used to be like that. After Solomon's death, between one of his generals and his son, they end up splitting the kingdom into the north and the south. halves of the kingdom. The southern half of the kingdom is called Judah. And between the 12 tribes, the 2 tribes down here are Judah and I think Benjamin's the other one. I don't know, I don't remember. And then the other 10 tribes lived in the northern half. Well, the Assyrians were pretty brutal when they conquered people. What they would do is when they conquered, so if they conquered our city, they would send everyone spread out across the empire. So you capture this area, you spread them all across the Assyrian Empire, and that way people from the same place can't unite against you. And then you bring people from all around the empire to occupy that land. So they were brutal in that regard, that everyone was split up. And so you might know about the 10 lost tribes of Israel. That's referring to the Assyrian conquest of the kingdom of Israel. And then Judah sticks around until the Babylonians come along and get them. Any questions about pre-Assyrian or Assyrian time history? I know I'm doing this real fast because hopefully you're somewhat familiar with this stuff. And we can just get to 600 BC. Okay, 600 BC. This is roughly what the world is going to look like when Thales, well, this is what the world looks like when Thales is born, and then we'll see how it changes as time goes on. Thales is going to be born over here in Melitus on the coast of Greece, next to this kingdom of Lydia. So after the fall of the Assyrian Empire, this is the same basic area. Egypt regains its independence. Egypt is Egypt. Babylon, so the city of Babylon down here becomes so powerful that it conquers this southern half of the Assyrian Empire. And then the Median Empire takes over the northern half and expands this way some. Now, even though the Medes look like they're the big shots here, it's Babylon that's the powerful empire, even though they have a lot less land mass. There's a lot more peoples along the rivers here. So Babylon's the powerhouse at this time. The Medes are probably the second powerhouse. And then you have the kingdom of Lydia over here, and then Egypt is Egypt. So what happens to the Median Empire is, down here in Persis, there's a Persian king by the name of Cyrus. We call him now Cyrus the Great. And he decides that he's going to start a revolution and overthrow the Median Empire. So Cyrus is going to come down here. He's going to start overthrowing the Median Empire to start conquering it. Lydia over here is going to realize that Cyrus is trying to conquer the Median Empire and think this is a good opportunity to grow. So Lydia is going to try attacking this half of the Median Empire while Cyrus is conquering this half. Suffice it to say, Cyrus didn't like Lydia moving in on his territory, and he's going to get his revenge. And Lydia is going to be off the map. But with Thales, Thales is going to exist in the time when Lydia is trying to do a bit of a land grab with the Median Empire, and Cyrus is going to be on the rise, establishing the Persian Empire. Any questions before we jump to the Persians? And just because we might accidentally say it down the road, the ancient Greeks didn't recognize the difference between the Median Empire and the Persian Empire that conquered it. To them, it was like an internal revolution that just happened. So they'll often refer to Persians as Medes. And they don't make any distinction that way. So Cyrus starts down here. This is the Persian Empire. And by 550 BC, you'll notice that he's reconquered all this land and he's right up against Lydia now. Well, it's only going to take him a few years to get Lydia. So in 3 years, he's got that. And then Persia goes on, and by 511 BC, this is what Persia is going to look like. So they just dominate the world. They are absolutely massive. And you'll notice that their borders now are coming really, really close to the tip of this peninsula right here, which we call Greece. So this is going to lead up to the Greco-Persian Wars. They're going to be in conflict, and those wars are going to happen. So talking about the Greco-Persian Wars, that's going to be the next historical piece that we tackle. This is all the history we're going to be covering up to that as far as the Middle East and Egypt. Any questions about the Persians before this? You all know the Greco-Persian Wars roughly, right?
Yeah.
Battle of 300, Battle of Thermopylae.
Marathon.
Battle of Marathon. Yep. That's all under the Greco-Persian Wars. It's roughly a 50-year conflict. Okay, so that's the Persians, and that's the Egyptians. So now, let me make sure you see where we're zooming in on now. So we talked about roughly what's going on down here. We talked about roughly what's going on over here. Now we're going to talk specifically about what's going on with the Greeks themselves. And early, we're going to be talking about this little island right here called Crete. That's where the Greeks start. So we're going to go back in time now and talk about just the Greek history, because up to this point they almost have no conflict with the rest of the world. So this is leading up to conflict, I guess. So zoomed in now on just Greece. Here's that island of Crete that I told you about. This island is where most historians would say that the Greek civilization starts. They called the people that lived on that little island Minoans, and I can't remember why now. What's the name of the king who, when he touched something, it turned to gold? Midas. So I think it was when they were doing a discovery, they thought that they were finding the ruins of the supposed King Midas, and so they called the peoples there Minoans. I think that's why, but I'm not 100% sure. Anyways, their capital here is Knossos. You'll notice that we're looking at 1400 to 1100 BC. The Minoans are way, way earlier than that. We're talking about 2000 BC up to around this time is when they stop. We're going to see the Mycenian Empire conquers them, but we're going to talk about Minoans for a second. So Minoans start out just down here, just on that island. As far as we can tell, they were pretty peaceful people and very much traders, so they relied largely on trade. They must have had the entire island because none of their cities had walls around them. So either they were very peaceful or they must have just had an amazing navy. And then we know that they traded a lot because we can see the same artifacts that we see here spread all across the eastern half of the Mediterranean. So they were big-time traders. You might know the story of the Minotaur. The Minotaur, so that's the Minoans. The Minotaur down in the labyrinth, and the Athenians had to sacrifice 7 youths to the Minotaur. I don't remember what it is. One of them was Theseus. He ends up killing the Minotaur, making it back to Athens. Now, that mythology is all fun and all, but there's reason to believe that Theseus was actually a real person, because then Athens becomes the dominant player in Attica. So this land right here we're going to call Attica, where Athens is at center. After that, it seems like Athens pretty much dominated all this region and is the powerhouse city in this area from there on out.
So how does that show that Thales was actually a real person?
We haven't talked about Thales yet.
Or
Theseus?
Theseus.
Because part of what he's claimed to do is what it looks like happened. So obviously the Minotaur wasn't a real story.
So when he got back, then what he did after he got back.
So
there's evidence.
There's good reason to believe that Theseus was an actual person in history that ended up leading Athens at some point and got Attica united around the city of Athens. But anything else in that story, it's hard to buy into. I don't think Poseidon gave anyone a white bull that a female then mated with and had an offspring that had the head of a bull and the body of a man. But who knows? Okay, so that's the Minoans, and then the more interesting ones are the Mycenians. So the Mycenians were the ones living on mainland Greece, on this major peninsula. And you see that they're also down here. We're not sure what exactly happened to the Minoans. Either they were conquered by the Mycenians, or there were just natural disasters that caused them to slowly die off, and the Mycenians ended up coming and invading and just taking the land. Not sure exactly what happened, but suffice it to say, come 1400, it's now Mycenian territory. And the Minoans, their relics are still there, so there could have been some of the culture adopted by the Mycenians, but we don't know much about what happened to them.
But do we know that they weren't there?
We know
They
that
died off?
we know that the Minoans were there, and whatever happened, their civilization drastically changed and started behaving a lot like these guys' civilization. So what happened? Was it a conquest? Was there? You can put some other pieces together. Like I know that. No, this isn't the Bronze Age collapse, because that's when the Mycenians are going away. Yeah, I don't know how you would tie together how they naturally died off, but it's just what I read. So then the Mycenians were the major Greeks. Now the Mycenians, you know some mythology about them. That's when the Battle of Troy happened. So the Greeks uniting against Troy over here, that was at the time of the Mycenian Empire. That was the Mycenian king who was leading that attack. And the Mycenian Empire became pretty dominant in the area. They were a much more military type people, built very massive walls. Some fun little story about them. So later Greeks, looking at the structures that the Mycenians left behind, because of how massive the stones were that were used in them, thought that they must have been built by giant cyclopses.
Oh.
So I don't know why cyclopses. I don't know where the single eye comes from. Maybe there's like some structure down there that looks like a one-eyed man. But big creatures must have been the ones who put those stones in place, because man couldn't do that. So you have the Mycenians, and then the Mycenian Empire goes down when pretty much everyone around the Mediterranean goes down. So there's something called the Bronze Age collapse, which happens around 1100 BC. We're not sure what exactly happens. It seems like there's a lot of things going into effect. So one of the things that it looks like happened is there was roughly a 10-year drought across 10 years of super dry weather, creating a drought across the area. There was supposedly a volcanic eruption that could have happened at this time. And then there's peoples referred to as the sea peoples, who seem to just come up from the north and just conquer all along the coast. So they destroy everywhere that they go. The only people able to withstand them are the Egyptians. They conquer all the way down the coast, clear down to Egypt. And Egypt we actually have the battle with the Sea people documented. That's how we know about these people, because the Egyptians were actually able to withstand the attack and hold out. And so they actually documented this going on. So you have the Bronze Age collapse, and this is important to know because when we get to the Greeks that we're talking about, it's very obvious in their minds that Greek civilization was once great, then there was a drop, and now they're coming back on the rise. They were very much aware of that fact. So after the Mycenaean Empire collapses, Greece goes into a dark age. In fact, they even lose writing. They can no longer write, so there's a huge disconnect between them and past peoples that lived in these regions.
So what happened to the Seas people? They come down, they conquer it, and they just left?
Hard to know. I would guess that the majority of them just integrated with whoever was there. It could have just been colonizing. Colonizing sounds like a lovely term, but so Greeks create a lot of colonies, and what do? They get 500 men, and they send them out to go create a colony. What do those men do? They go and try and find a small town somewhere out there that they could easily overpower. They kill all the men and mate with the women and start a colony. And that's how you start a colony. So they could have colonized the bunch of areas and just integrated with the populations. But yeah, we don't exactly know who they were, where they came from, or what happened to them. All we know for sure is that the Egyptians were able to withstand them. And it took a huge toll on their economy, and Egypt was never the same since. So that's actually part of the reason that Egypt collapses, and then later you notice that they were conquered by the Assyrians. That's the first time that some external force comes in and conquers Egypt. Never the same power after they sees people attack them. The reason that they're never the same is, at the time, your military was your chariots, and chariots are very expensive. And the Seas people were very good at combat against chariots, so even though Egypt won, it was a huge economic hit to them because they pretty much lost their military. And so that's why they never are quite the same again. But anyway, so Mycenians, they come onto the scene, and they fall off with the Bronze Age collapse. Now, after they've fallen off, then there seems to be a migration of people coming in. Some people think it was a conquest, some people say a migration of what we call the Dorians, and they move into the mainland. And so this right here is just a map of the dialects spoken around Egypt, or around Greece at the time. So the Dorians seem to have come in. They have a huge effect down here and down here, but most notably Sparta. So Sparta associates themselves with the Dorians, and Sparta, once they get established, once they conquest, Sparta always and forever views themselves as on enemy soil, as an invading people. Sparta, throughout all their history, never views themselves as this is our land. They tell themselves that, no, we actually came here and we conquered these people. You need to know Sparta to understand Greek history, because prior to the rise of Athens, if you were to ask a Greek, what's the greatest city-state, they'd laugh and say, obviously Sparta. So that's why Sparta is so important. It's the ideal that they look to. Once we get to like Plato's Republic, you'll notice that he heavily relies on the way that Sparta operated. So we need to quickly go over what Sparta is and how they operate. And this is the same Sparta like fighting at the Battle of Thermopylae, Sparta. So Sparta seems to be these Dorians coming and invading the area, and they're able to take over this area and start Sparta as we know it. There could have been a town already there that they just integrated with and then start Sparta. But once they become established, what they do, there's a mountain range right here that the map doesn't show. They come up and over here, they conquer these people and enslave these people to serve them, and they refer to them as the Helots. And annually, every year, Sparta redeclares war on the Helots to remind themselves we are here as invaders and we are conquering peoples. They conquered the people over here as Helots, and they provided for Sparta all the food, and they were basically the working class for Sparta. And so everyone that was actually a Spartan citizen was the military, was in the military. Spartan lived, eat, and breathed war and their military. And so maybe talk a little bit about the government that they had in place. Their government was that they had two kings. These were not hierarchical, hereditary kings. So it went from generation to generation, father to son. And then they had a council of elders for people over the age of 60. So once you were over the age of 60, you could be voted into this council of elders. And together that consisted of 30 people. So Sparta was ruled by those 30 people, 2 kings, and then the 28 elders. And then they had 5, they called them ephors. And what they did is they were a check against the kings. So they at any time could accuse the kings of criminal behavior, but they had to get a majority of them to convict him of anything. So there were 5 of them. If 3 of them agreed that the king did something wrong, then he's guilty. Now, the way that these ephors were decided was completely by law. Any random Spartan could have been one of them, and it was a 1-year term. And at the end of the 1 year, you have to give an accounting to the new ephors coming in of everything that you did, and they have to approve of it. So, in short, you've got a city-state that is very much controlled by people over the age of 60, and those who have the ability to rein the kings in are there for very short term, and are very worried about doing anything wrong that they might end up at the end of their year having to account for. So the point of all that is Sparta is very conservative. There is no political change in Sparta. Sparta always has been and always will be the way that Sparta is for the time that we covered. The exact same laws, nothing changes there. Very stable. So they conquered the Helots over here. You have the Spartans here. Because their way of life is so brutal, they can never get a very big population. They always have a pretty small population of soldiers. And so what the Spartans are mostly worried about, 1, they're worried about the Helots over here rising against them, and 2, the Spartans, they cannot afford to lose men during battles. So they quickly create a league with this whole part of Greece, where everyone else in Greece pretty much agrees to let Sparta run things for them as far as determining battle. Let Sparta run their diplomacy with outside city-states. And that way, they're pretty stable internally, and no one really wants to mess with them internally because then they know Sparta's going to be at the head. So Sparta's got the best soldiers. Sparta will beat anyone. They lived a completely communal lifestyle. That's going to be important. They live completely communal. The citizens of Sparta, you don't own any property. You eat your meals with everyone else in a public area. You have certain slaves assigned to you, like 100 slaves or whatever, that are your slaves. You're expected to contribute a certain amount at every meal to the meal for everyone to eat. So communal lifestyle, brutal lifestyle, no private property, and you have the kings ruling. Nothing really changes there. So I think that gives you good basic taste for Sparta, and all these people are basically united with Sparta. Nobody wants to go to war against the Spartans. And then Athens is going to be completely different, but we don't need to worry about Athens for now.
The people who are united with Sparta, they don't live the Spartan lifestyle.
They don't live the Spartan lifestyle. So Sparta just conquers these people over here, so now they have their helots, so they don't have to work for a living. Now, because they have such few citizens, because it's so hard to make it as a Spartan citizen, I mean, so early on you have to be approved whether or not you even get to live or die. They look at the babies. If the baby isn't fit, if it's in any way deformed, then they get rid of the baby. Then your upbringing is very brutal. So, for example, if you were a Spartan and you got caught stealing, you were punished, but not for trying to steal, but for getting caught. You were encouraged to steal. In fact, they would intentionally not give their youths enough to live on, so that they had to steal to stay alive. So very brutal upbringing for these Spartan kids, where you had to do things like steal food to stay alive, but they only punish them if they get caught because they say you did it stupid. The way that it worked is as the youths grow up, it's just the men in the military. The women actually have it pretty nice in Sparta. But the men in the military, once they get all the way through the academy, I think they put them into groups of, they split them up into groups of 100, and then the 100 decide amongst them who they thought was the most outstanding youth, and he from there on out is basically the captain of those 100. And so they have a very tight structure. You very much know your commanding officer from birth. I mean, you grew up with this guy, you knew him very well, so they're very united people, eat all their meals together. Even when you were married, you still had to live communally, live where all the other soldiers lived, I think until the age of 30. And it was expected that you would get married and that you would kind of keep your marriage secret and no one would know that you were married to the girl. But at the same time, marriage was encouraged. I don't remember what the age is, but by the age of 50, if a man wasn't married, he had to walk naked up and down in front of the gymnasium where the young people worked out. Part of his shaming for not ever getting married and not contributing citizens. And once a man contributed 3 sons to Sparta, if he could get 3 sons accepted as Spartan citizens, then he was now free from all military service from there on out. So, very much encourage people to have kids, but those kids would have a brutal life coming up. So, I think that gives us a good feel for Sparta going forward. Any other questions? Trying to get through this history as fast as possible to get to the philosophy. Nothing? Okay. So, that's a quick run through. We just need to talk about one more thing you need to know with the Greeks, which this map covers pretty well. And you'll notice Greece is right here, but look at the blue. The blue there are the Greeks. And so it could be a little confusing early on as we're talking about people over here or people over here and we're calling them Greeks. Why do we do that? Well, Greece itself is a very mountainous place with valleys, and the cities always start in these valleys, and they can grow food for them to begin with, but eventually the population outgrows what they can provide food for. So that encourages them to start producing colonies. They decide we'll start growing our food other places. So the main cities here are sending out people to go and start creating colonies all over the place to start growing their food somewhere else, and then they end up just trading it back in Greece. And then on top of that, once they get these colonies going, the Greeks decide, you know what, it's more profitable to do things like grow olives and grapes and produce wine and olive oil than it is to actually produce your own food. So it gets to the point where they are relying very heavily externally for their food and kind of give up on producing the food locally to any significant effect. So that is why the Greeks quickly spread out all over the place. So even though Greece is this right here, all these people are Greeks because of these colonies that are going off, and we already talked about how they produced a colony. 500 men up, go find a nice little town, and just take it. And so on top of that, since they're very spread out and relying very much on trade now to get their food, what that's doing is creating this trade network, so they're working with peoples of different nationalities now. So this is what's going to connect the Greeks very much both to the Egyptians and what's going on in the Far East over here. It's the fact that they're this spread out and have a very active trade route. So information, in terms of ancient times, is being spread like crazy across these trade routes. Much, much easier to trade across water than it is across land. And so they have that nice benefit of having water between all their cities. You'll notice on this map, so this is 550 BC. You'll notice Persian Empire is right here. Pretty soon they're going to be conquering Lydia. When they conquer Lydia, they're also going to get all this blue over here, which is when their initial run-in with the Greeks is going to happen. So Persia, pretty soon, within 3 years, is going to be conquering all this, and we're going to get their first conflict with the Greeks. And we'll have some stories about that later. Just looking forward, or for those of you who know a little bit more about history, you notice the Phoenicians here as well. They were the major traders. They trade big in the east and then across the sea, but they were the major traders at this time. If someone's a trader, there's a good chance that they're a Phoenician. And so they also, similarly, had their colonies spread all over the place. And there's a very important colony over here, probably can't read that, way too small, called Carthage. That's going to become very important down the road. And there's also this little no-name town at the south of the Etruscans called Rome. That's going to become a big deal in a few hundred years. But just to point those out. Okay, so I think we got a feel for major history with the Greeks. Any questions about that map before we go forward? Okay, so we've got the Greeks, they're coming along. The last major question we need to answer before we jump into an actual philosopher is, why did philosophy start with the Greeks? That's the big question. So we know that philosophy existed implicitly. Anything explicit was mythological, metaphorical, mystical. What do we mean by that? The way that someone would argue their ethics is with some mystical story, and then they tell you the moral of the story is. So it's very much moral of the story type things is how arguments were made. No one was making explicit arguments about this is the way that things should be. So the Greeks were the first to give explicit rational explanations for the phenomena that we witness, for why things are or are not, why they're true or why they're false. And then second, trade. Well, this is why we say they're the first philosophers. They're the first ones doing this. Now, why were the Greeks the first ones to start doing this? First off, trade. They had exposure to tons of ideas in other parts of the world where people have been thinking for a long time. The Egyptians had been measuring land and building massive structures for a very long time. The Babylonians, we didn't mention this, but the Babylonians had been staring at the stars for a very long time, mapping the planets, looking at how the heavens are moving. And so between those two, those are going to be the two major sources of information that we see coming in. The second one is political freedom. So the Greeks at this time are city-states, and since Greece is so mountainous, you have city-states separated by mountain. For the most part, they're completely independent. There's no way for them to unite with each other. And so you have tons of different governments with tons of different levels of freedom. And so typically, the more political freedom you have, the more people can think however they want to think and express those views and pursue those views. It's not limited to this mystical priest class where you have to buy into all this Egyptian mythology before you're able to start thinking now and live a life where you can think. A lot of these Greeks could individually just become somewhat wealthy, independent citizens and then live a life of luxury. And then the last thing that a lot of people argue for why it starts with the Greeks is the Greek religion is very different from every other religion in that their gods are bounded by fate and necessity. And so there's already this notion just in their mythology of some universal principle that's so powerful that even the gods are limited by it. So this is going to be their foundation for starting to think about universal principles that just apply everywhere, like fate and necessity. And so the author of the book early on, he's going to start talking, the first section of the book, he talks about the war between, his first section is talking about the war between, what is it called, poetry? Poetry and philosophy. And the war between philosophy and poetry is the war between thinking this way and thinking this way right out the door. And why are they at war in Greece? Your Greek education early on, how many of you know Homer? Homer, the blind poet Homer, he's pretty famous, and Hesiod. These were the people that you got your early education from. When you were being educated in early Greece, what would you do? You would hear the poems of Homer and memorize them. You'd hear what Hesiod had to say and memorize it. So Homer, he lived during the dark ages of Greece when writing went out of existence, and so he just memorized a bunch of poems, and he was someone who would go around just reciting those poems. Hesiod comes a little bit later than Homer. Hesiod tries just giving a rational mythological structure to all the gods that Homer talks about, somehow trying to unite them all together into one coherent system of gods. And so Homer and Hesiod, learning these people, that was your education as a youth in Greece. It's not like you would go and study mathematics. That wasn't a thing you could go do yet. So early education was this type of education. So when something new starts coming on the scene, then it's going to be contending against the way that education is already done. So there's two ways that we can view that conflict between philosophy and poetry. That's this, and then it's very much a conflict because the new way of thinking is going to start taking precedence over what Homer said. Homer is no longer just the authority, and once Homer, I mean, these guys viewed Homer the way that 1600 AD Christians would view the Bible. If it's in the Bible, you don't argue with it. You want to get literate? Go study the Bible. Similarly, these guys thought about Homer in that same avenue, probably not as extreme, but if Homer said it, it's kind of the way it must be. So, now we get to the first group of philosophers. The first group of philosophers we call the Pre-Socratics. Now, why do we call them the Pre-Socratics? One, they come before Socrates, so we call them the Pre-Socratics. Now, a few of the philosophers that we talk about aren't necessarily before Socrates. They're going to overlap with Socrates, be contemporaries of Socrates. The reason that we still call them a pre-Socratic is because Socrates fundamentally changed the way that philosophers would think about things and what their interests were. So there's a drastic change between what we call the pre-Socratic philosophers and what they were interested in, and then when Socrates comes onto the scene, things change. In short, pre-Socratic philosophers were basically interested in what we would now call physics. Socrates brings ethics to the forefront of philosophy, and then we'll see how systems evolve from there. So everyone that we'll be talking about from here on out is classified as a pre-Socratic. The first group of pre-Socratics that we're going to be talking about are the Ionians. 5 major ones we'll be talking about. First off, Thales of Melitus. He's the very first philosopher. His year 624 BC to 545 BC. So notice he's living through Persia, conquering Lydia, and he lives through Lydia trying to conquer the Medians and expand its empire, and that doesn't really work out for him. Then you have an Axamander of Melitus. Now, Melitus is in Lydia, so Persians are going to end up conquering the city that these guys come from. He's 610 BC to 546 BC. And Anaximenes, so you have Anaximander, Anaximenes from 586 to 526 BC. Then we're going to have Xenophonies. So these three are all from the same city. They're going to be very much interested in what we now call physics. Xenophonies, he is from Colophon, which is a city nearby again. And he's going to be very much giving a critique of Homer and Hesiod. He's going to take issue with what they have the gods doing. For example, Homer and Hesiod write about the gods committing adultery. He's going to say, no, a god wouldn't do that. You're assigning to gods the evil deeds that humans do. That's pretty sacrilegious. And then Heraclitus here, he's going to be the first major pre-Socratic philosopher we talk about. The big three are Heraclitus, Parmenides, and Pythagoras. So he'll be our first big one. For those of you who did essays, are any of these on your list? Who did you have?
Heraclitus.
You have Heraclitus. Who did you have?
So I had Heraclitus.
Oh, you also had Heraclitus?
Thales.
Thales. You did Thales. All right, are you ready?
Yes.
I told you that you were going to have to read your papers for the class before I did my presentation on him. So since you did Thales, he's going to be our first one. So we're going to start with Thales of Melitus. Let me say one more thing before we have you get up. I said that those were all the Ionians.
Right.
So let me go back to this map one more sec. Ionia is the name of this land over here. So it's blue, they're Greeks, but it's on the western half of Lydia here. So Melitus is right there. So this is where the first three philosophers are going to be from. And then Colophon and Ephesus are other cities up around here. So they're all really, really close together over here on this end of Asia Minor. So this right here is called Ionia. And then we're going to jump to the Italian school, which is going to be over here. And then we'll finally get to actual Greeks in the sense that they actually come from the landmass of Greece. So when we're talking about the Ionian school, we're talking about Ionians are over here. And in particularly, we're going to be talking about Melitus.
What time period or what frame of time does Persia conquer Lydia?
So Persia conquers 547 BC. So let's go back to their dates really quick. You'll notice that all of them live for Persia's conquest of Lydia. They lived through that event. Any other questions before we jump to Thales? All right, we're ready for Thales of Melitus, and we'll let him give a short presentation, and then I'll take it from there. Make sure you're in front of the camera.
Here's the face of Thales.
Oh, there we go.
All right. Thales was a Greek mathematician, astronomer, and pre-Socratic philosopher from Miletus in Ionia, Asia Minor. He was one of the 7 sages of Greece. Many, most notably Aristotle, regarded him as the first philosopher in Greek tradition, and he is otherwise historically recognized as the first individual in Western civilization known to have entertained and engaged in scientific philosophy. Thales is recognized for breaking from the use of mythology to explain the world and the universe, and instead explaining natural objects and phenomena by naturalistic theories and hypotheses, in a precursor to modern science. Almost all the other pre-Socratic philosophers followed him in explaining nature as deriving from the unity of everything based on the existence of a single ultimate substance, instead of using mythological explanations. Aristotle regarded him as the founder of the Ionian school and reported Thales' hypothesis that the original principle of nature and the nature of matter was a single material substance, water. In mathematics, Thales used geometry to calculate the heights of pyramids and the distance of ships from the shore. He was the first known individual to use deductive reasoning applied to geometry by deriving 4 corollaries to Thales' theorem. He is the first known individual to whom a mathematical discovery has been attributed. Thales was a massively intelligent philosopher who reached into and influenced many fields, but most notable are his contributions to geometry and his theories on basic matter and phenomena. Thales was known for his innovative use of geometry. His understanding was theoretical as well as practical. For example, he said, "The greatest is space, for it holds all things." Topos is a Newtonian-style space, since the verb kroi has the connotation of yielding before things or spreading out to make room for them, which is extension. Within this extension, things have position, points, lines, planes, and solids related by distances and angles follow from this presumption. Thales understood similar triangles and right triangles, and what is more, used that knowledge in practical ways. The story is told in Diagoras Laertius, when he measured the height of the pyramids by their shadows at the moment when his own shadow was equal to his height.
Pause for 1 second. So that's Diogenes Laertius, and he is a historian that we'll reference 100 times, so notice that name. Diogenes Laertius.
The story is told in Diogenes Laertius, when he measured the height of the pyramids by their shadows at the moment when his own shadow was equal to his height. A right triangle with 2 equal legs is a 45-degree right triangle, all of which are similar. The length of the pyramid's shadow measured from the center of the pyramid at the moment must have been equal to its height. This story indicates that he was familiar with the Egyptian second, the ratio of the run to the rise or of the slope, or otherwise known as the cotangent. More practically, Thales used the same method to measure the distances of ships at sea, said Idomaeus. All you need for this measurement is 3 straight sticks pinned at one end and the knowledge of your altitude. One stick goes vertically into the ground and a second is made level. With the third, you can sight the ship and calculate the second from the height and the stick, and of the stick, its distance from the point of insertion to the line of sight. There are 2 theorems of Thales in elementary geometry. One is known as Thales' theorem, having to do with a triangle inscribed in a circle and having a circle's diameter as one leg, another theorem also being called the Intercept Theorem. In addition, Epistemonomists attribute him to the discovery that a circle is bisected by its diameter, that the base angles of an isosceles triangle are equal and the vertical angles are equal. When Thales visited Egypt, he observed that whenever the Egyptian drew two intersecting lines, they would measure the vertical angles to make sure that they are equal. Thales concluded that one can prove that all vertical angles are equal if one accepted some general notions, such as all straight angles are equal, equals added to equals are equal, and equals subtracted from equals are equal. The evidence of the primacy of Thales comes to us from a book by Proclus, who wrote 1,000 years after Thales, but is believed to have a copy of Epistemonomists' book. Proclus wrote, Thales was the first to go to Egypt and bring back to Greece the study. He goes on to tell us that in addition to applying the knowledge he gained in Egypt, he himself discovered many propositions and disclosed the underlying principles of many others to his successors, in some case his method being more general, in others more empirical. Early Greeks and other civilizations before them often invoked idiosyncratic explanations of natural phenomena with reference to the will of anthropomorphic gods and heroes. Instead, Thales aimed to explain natural phenomena by a rational hypothesis that referenced natural processes themselves. For example, rather than assuming the earthquakes were the result of supernatural whims, Thales explained them by hypothesizing that the earth floats on water and that earthquakes occur when the earth is rocked by waves. Thales was a hypothesist, one who thinks that matter is alive or containing souls. Aristotle wrote of Thales, Thales thought all things are full of gods. Aristotle bases the origin of Thales' thought on matter generally containing souls to Thales' thinking initially on the fact of because magnets move iron, the presence of movement of matter indicated this matter contained life. Thales, according to Aristotle, asked what the nature was of the objects so that it would behave in its characteristic way. Physis comes from Greek word phyan, to grow, related to our word be. Natura is the way a thing is born, again with the stamp of what it is in itself. Aristotle characterizes most of the philosophers at first as thinking that the principles in the form of matter were the only principles of all things, where principle is arche, matter is hyal, and form is idios. Excuse me, a lot of that is just Greek language that was just translation. Arche is translated as principle, but the two words do not have precisely the same meaning. A principle of something is merely prior related to in either chronological or logical. An arche, to rule, dominates an object in some way. If the arche is taken to be an origin, then specific causality is implied. That is, B is supposedly to be characteristically B, just because it comes from A, which dominates it. The arche that Aristotle had in mind in his well-known passage of the first Greek scientists are not necessarily chronologically prior to their objects, but are constituents of it. For example, in pluralism, objects are composed of earth, air, fire, and water, but those elements do not disappear with the production of the object. They remain an arche within, as do the atoms of the atomists. What Aristotle is really saying is that the first philosophers were trying to define the substances of which all material objects are composed. As a matter of fact, that is exactly what modern scientists are attempting to accomplish in nuclear physics, which is the second reason why Thales is described as the first Western scientist. However, some contemporary scholars reject this. Thales' most famous philosophical position was his cosmological thesis, which comes down to us through a passage from Aristotle's metaphysics. In the work, Aristotle unequivocally reported Thales' hypotheses about the nature of all matter, that the originating principle of nature was a single material substance, or water. Aristotle then proceeded to offer a number of conjectures based on his own observations to lend some credence as to why Thales may have advanced this idea, although Aristotle did not hold it himself. He laid out his own thinking about matter and form, which may shed some light on the ideas of Thales in metaphysics, that from which is everything that exists, and from which it first becomes, and into which it is. Rendered at last, its substance remaining under it, but transforming in qualities, that they say is the element and the principle of things that are. For it is necessary that there be some nature, either one or more than one, from which become the other things of the object being saved. Thales, the founder of this type of philosophy, says that that is water. In this quote, we see Aristotle's depiction of the problems of change and the definition of substance. He asks if an object changes, is it the same or different? In either case, how can it be changed from one to another? The answer is the substance is saved, but acquires or loses different qualities. Aristotle conjectured that Thales reached his conclusion by contemplating that the nourishment of all things is moist, and that even hot is created from the wet and lives by it. Thales thought the earth must be a flat disk, which is floating in an expanse of water. Heraclitus, Copernicus, states that Thales drew his conclusion from seeing moist substance turn into air, slime, and earth. It seems likely that Thales viewed the earth as solidifying from the water in which it floated, and the oceans that surround it. Although much of what we know about Thales is passed down from secondary sources such as Aristotle, due to the fact that we don't have many original texts, we can still glean a lot of his ideas, and more practically his theorems in geometry, which all have very practical uses. Thales was one of the first philosophers to look at common events or phenomena outside of the scope of religion or deities. For this reason, he could be considered the first scientific philosopher, and is definitely one of the original philosophers in Greek tradition, if not the first, that began trying to piece together a concept of the world through careful thought and observation. Although it is easy for us to see many of the flaws in his theories, they still serve a lot of use to the world, not only to show a history of the evolution of thought, but also the thought processes and logic that came out of Thales' work, as well as the Greek philosophers in general.
Cool, thank you. You get a pause. That's okay. Okay. So, Thales. So, as I just told you, from Melitus, right here on the coast, that's the city that he's from. He's one of the Ionian philosophers. Mathematician, astronomer, philosopher. He founded the Milesian school. He was the first on those following philosophers, so founded the Milesian school. He mentioned he was one of the 7 sages. Another one of the 7 sages was, who was it? The only other one you would have known the name of. The one at Athens. Now I just lost his name. Should have put down. Oh well, he's one of the 7 sages, one of the 7 wise men. So these 7 wise men for ancient Greece, they would meet together and they kind of helped maintain political stability for the area. So they tried to work out major conflicts a lot of the time. So that's what the sages were. One of the 7 wise men, they each had a famous saying. Thales' famous saying is, everything is water, or something to that effect. He mentioned already, measured the heights of the pyramids and the distance of ships from shores, and explained that. And then he also mentioned Thales' theorem, and he mentioned that Thales found 4, what are they called? Give me the word, you guys. Short proof that follows immediately from a theorem. Corollary, thank you. 4 corollaries of the theorem. So what the theorem is he proved that when you have a triangle inscribed in half a circle, then this angle right here is always a right angle. This is a theorem that he was talking about. So how does this theorem work really quick? We can go over it really quick. He knew that isosceles triangles, first off, what's an isosceles triangle? Isosceles triangle is a triangle where those two sides are the same length, right? Now, something that was already known to him is a theorem called, has a funny name, Pons Asinorum. Yep, not this name. Which means for isosceles triangles, their base angles are the same. So when you've got this triangle right here inside of the circle, here's our 3 points that we're interested in, A, B, C. That's the triangle that we're talking about. And then this is the origin. By definition of a circle, every point on a circle is the same distance from the origin, right? So you know that this line, and this line are all the same. So you see how that's giving you two isosceles triangles? So you know that now that this angle, it's labeled alpha in this picture, is now the same big as this angle. So I now know that this angle is the same size as this angle, and I know that this angle is the same size as this angle, because that's two isosceles triangles. You see that? The other thing that he already knew, so he knew Pons Asinorum, and he also knew that the angle sums of a triangle add up to a straight angle, or the way that you say it now is, if you add up all the angles, you get 180 degrees in a triangle. So we have two triangles there. So if we add up this angle, this angle, this angle, this angle, this angle, and this angle, that's adding up all the angles for two triangles, so we should get 360 degrees. So we'll write the math really quick. I'll call this angle right here, I don't know what to call it, we'll call it, doesn't matter, you know that, well, yeah, we'll just label it so we can say something. A, B, C, I'll call that one D, that one E. You know D and E together are a straight angle, or 180 degrees, right? So in other words, we have 2 alpha plus 2 beta plus, I called it D plus E, is equal to 360 degrees, right? With me so far? The D and the E together we know are 180 degrees. Still follow that step? Now subtract 180 from both sides, we get 2 alpha plus 2 beta is equal to 180 degrees. Subtracting 180 from both sides, with me? Now divide by 2, we get alpha plus beta is equal to 90.
Dang.
So that's his proof for showing that this angle right here is always a right angle. So that is the theorem that he found the conjectures for. Conjectures.
Corollaries.
Thank you, corollaries. The corollaries for it.
Did he actually use degrees?
No, I was just keeping it, keeping it in terms of what you would understand. I think it's the Babylonians who introduced our current system for measuring angles, but I'm not positive.
So,
If it is the Egyptians, then it's possible that he did, but I think it's the Babylonians who used base 12 system.
so can you kind of explain how he used that to measure the pyramid's height?
How he used that to measure the pyramid's height?
Where would you even begin?
So here's a really simple way to measure the pyramid's height. The problem is finding the center of the pyramid, which I won't go over how you do that, but once you do that, then getting the height's pretty easy. So let's say that I now know that this is the height I'm trying to figure out, right?
Okay.
So what I can do is I can take a stick and cut it so it's as tall as me. So here I am, and I cut a stick so it's as tall as me and I put it on the ground. Or I get someone else to do this, because this is going to be boring. Then I stand there until my shadow is as long as the stick. At the same time, measure the shadow of the pyramid, and now you got height.
Oh. Okay. So that stick is kind of your unit of measurement?
No, the point was, the time of day where my shadow is the same tall as me, the pyramid shadow is the same tall as it.
Oh, interesting.
So you're carefully ready to measure the pyramid's height at that certain time of day, and I say when, as soon as my shadow gets as long as the stick that I laid on the ground. Now that's not exactly how he did it, but it gives you the concept.
Yeah. I thought it in Louis' presentation, he used this theorem to prove the height of the pyramid.
He used it to measure the ships out to sea.
Oh, the ship's out to sea.
Yeah, that one's more complicated, and that one I can't give you quick.
Yeah.
Okay, so now some major facts from his life. One that Louis didn't measure or talk about that worth going over. He became a very wealthy man. The story goes that one day someone came up to him and made fun of him a little bit. Like, you're this great guy, yet look how poor you are. And so he decided to spend a bit of time studying the weather. And he studied the weather to predict, by studying the weather, he predicted that we were going to have a really good season coming up. In particular, there was going to be a good olive season. So olives, which were, at this time, Greece is growing a ton of olives. He knew that olives were going to be through the roof in production. So what he did is he went out and he leased out all the oil presses that you used to turn it to oil. And since no one was competing with him at the time, he was able to monopolize on it. He got all the oil presses in the area were his. He had rented them out. He didn't own them, he rented them, but that means he was guaranteed use of them for that time period. And then so when the harvest came in, and people had just a ton of olives and desperately needed those presses, he could charge basically whatever he wanted for it, and then amassed a ton of wealth. And the way that the story goes is, from that is what he was able to use to basically travel the world from then on out. So that's all just a story, but it's a fun story. And then you notice Lydia was going to war against the Medes at this time, right? You remember that Lydia thought it would be a good chance for them to expand their empire, since Cyrus the Great's causing a revolt, and Cyrus the Great slowly building up Persia. So he's going to war against the Medes now, trying to expand his empire. And he had a problem where he needed to get his army across the river, but he couldn't build a bridge. So there's no bridge. He didn't want to take time to build a bridge across the river. He needed to get his army across the river. So he had Thales there, and he asked Thales to help him do it. So what Thales had to do is, here's the river. Thales told him, what I want you to do is to camp your army right there on the bank of the river, and then have him dig a massive trench around like this. So it parted the river two ways, and it parted it enough, and it split the water up enough that it was shallow enough that his soldiers could now easily walk back and forth across it, which they needed also to go back, because they go on, they get the crap kicked out of them, and they have to come back, and they're still able to cross it. Predicted an eclipse in 585 BC. This is actually one of the major ways that we date him. All those years I put on there, by the way, until we get to, I think Aristotle's the first one that we actually know the years on, are wild predictions that people have pieced together. And sometimes we just don't even have a clue what to do with them, and so we just stick 1 year on them and we say they were kicking this year. So the fact that this eclipse was predicted by Thales is one of our major ways of locating him in history, because we know exactly when that eclipse happened. And the fact that he was able to predict an eclipse is good signs that he either got hold of some information coming from Babylon or went and studied in Babylon for a while. I've heard it both ways. I don't think the author does a Babylon one, so I'll explain that one more. In Babylon, they're very interested in the heavens, looking at the stars and looking at eclipses, and then they would chart these things as they happen and keep massive records of all the eclipses that had happened. But one of the things that we're going to notice with these people in the East and people in Egypt is, even though they do all this, they find all these empirical discoveries, discovering when and where these eclipses are happening, they were not good with the abstractions. And so Thales was able to look at the data and make a prediction based off of what it was doing to predict an upcoming eclipse. So he didn't do all the work charting all this stuff to prepare him to make that prediction, but he was the one that was able to make the prediction. And so it's that using your given information to determine something new, that abstraction, which is what we're going to see is one of those fundamental pieces at the heart of philosophy starting, and what the Greeks are doing that the rest of the world just isn't doing. Calculate the duration of the year and the timing of the equinoxes and the solstices. We all know what the equinoxes are. That's when spring and fall start. And solstices, that's summer and winter. And then, like he said, Thales aimed to explain natural phenomena via rational hypothesis that referred to natural processes themselves. Lightning is not because Zeus is really mad. It's for another reason. And he would try to explain these things naturally. Now, his major interests are in change and multiplicity, and it's hard. I'm going to try and get you confused by this so that you can understand why they were confused. And the example I like to use is lighting a match. If I hold a match in my hand and I light it, and it burns, and I let it burn until it's just ash, that match is now ash. And it's still somehow the same stuff. I watch that match change into ash. So somehow whatever that ash stuff is must have been in that match before it burned. And whatever was in that match before it burned must somehow still be in that ash stuff. So there's got to be some underlying something connecting these two. As different and as wildly different as they seem, they must somehow be connected. And this is a huge leap forward in thought, that all these things have to somehow be connected and be explainable by the same stuff. He talks about how in nuclear physics, we're still doing this. It's a theory out there called string theory. String theory is trying to say that everything in the universe is really just these vibrating strings, and that's what it is. It's the same thing that Thales was trying to do, and he's the first one trying to do this. Trying to explain that everything must somehow be connected. And let me try and confuse you by change now for a second. Let's say we've got a caterpillar, and you name the caterpillar Tim. This is your pet caterpillar. And he's going to turn into a butterfly. And so you have your butterfly Tim. Now, you did not take Tim, throw him away, and go grab a butterfly named Tim. Tim changed into a butterfly, right? You with me on that? So, it's still the same pet. It's still Tim, right? You still have the same thing you started with before and after. You still have Tim. But he changed. And change means it's not the same. So you have the same thing, but you don't have the same thing. How does that work?
He uses different pronouns.
That's fine. So this is why they were so confused, because change is already starting to seem like it implies some sort of logical contradiction. If something changes, that means it's not the same, but since it's only change and not substitution, it is the same. So it both is and isn't what it was. And so this is what confused them about change. And multiplicity, why are they confused by multiplicity? That's one I had to explain at first. There seems to be lots of things, but somehow those things can change into each other, so there must be some underlying one stuff that you can somehow, just different arrangements of it or something can somehow give us everything that we see. So that's why these early Greeks are all going to be confused by change and multiplicity. Thales was one of the first. If there's a change, there must have been something that changes, yet does not change. So that. Oh, here's another great one. Consider that a cow eats grass and then produces milk. Isn't that crazy? Doesn't this imply that milk is somehow composed of the same stuff as grass? The cow doesn't produce milk unless you give it grass, and if you give it grass, it seems like it must be turning it into milk. Something's coming out of the cow, the only thing going in is grass. Does that mean you can somehow rearrange milk and get grass? How is this possible? Now, we have a lot more understanding of chemistry than he had, but you can see how this could be a very confusing thing to witness.
Yeah, but
how is that grass turning into milk?
Even then, everything we have are just well-proven theories, or
All our scientific knowledge is just scientific knowledge. It's not mathematical knowledge.
yeah.
That's correct.
So even now, we're just still confused by changing multiplicity.
We're not near as confused as these guys were.
I don't know.
Okay, so yeah, could it be that all things are just made up of one elemental stuff? There's one underlying arche is the word that they're going to use, one underlying principle that we can use to explain all things. If so, what is the nature of this unifying, unchanging substance that is disguised by the appearance of constant change? What's the one stuff underlying everything and is responsible for why it looks like object A can change into object B? So that's what he was after. And, well, that's what he was after. All right. So what was his big answer to that? That's going to be one of his major philosophical doctrines. Water is the nature of all things, the arche, the fundamental substance, or I'm typically going to say the one stuff. I'm going to say Thales thought the one stuff was water. A lot of philosophers are going to argue about what the one stuff is. Thales says water. Second thing, he's going to say all things have souls in them. And third thing, he's going to say the all is divine. These are important because these are things that later philosophers are going to pick up on. So we're going to go into each one of those in more detail.
What did they mean by soul? Sorry, go ahead.
I was wondering what you mean by the all is divine.
Oh, we'll get into each one of these topics more. So we're going to start out with going over 1, then 2, then 3.
What did they mean by soul, though?
Soul?
Yeah, when he says soul, there's a soul in all things. What was his meaning behind that?
Yeah, so I'll address that one on the second one. So we'll do water first, and if I didn't answer it well enough, then let's bring it back up and make sure that you guys are content. So first, we'll talk about the water is the one stuff. The water makes up everything. He's the first material monist. Material meaning, well, start with the monist. Monist meaning everything's really composed of one stuff, and that one stuff is somehow a physical material thing. Because we're going to get later thinkers who think that it's just all one big illusion in the mind or something like that. So the fact that it's material and it's only one stuff is very important. So he hypothesized that the originating principle of nature and the nature of matter was a single material substance, namely water. Now, we can laugh that he says water now, but let's see why he thought it was water. First, we'll take Aristotle's take on the subject. So this is a direct quote from Aristotle in his Metaphysics. Thales, the founder of this kind of philosophy, says that the principle is water, and therefore declared the earth to be on water. Perhaps taking the supposition from the fact that the nutrient of all things is moist, and that heat comes from. Oh, he actually read this exact thing. So he read this exact quote to us already. In short, Aristotle is very much a biologist. And so here he's listing out the things why water is very much associated with life. And so he notices that water is very much associated with life. I guess we can just finish it. All things is moist, and that heat comes to be and is sustained by the moist. That meaning that you living organisms that produce heat are maintained by water, and so water must somehow be going into keeping your heat going. That seems counterintuitive to us now, but you can see why he thought it. That from which they come to be is the principle of things, so ultimately coming from water. He also noticed that the seeds of everything have a moist nature, and that water is in the beginning of the growth of moist things. You got to water plants for them to start growing, and so they must have some nature in them that wants water. Thales, at any rate, is said to have explained the principle and origins of things in this way. So you can read what Aristotle actually has to say about this in his Metaphysics. Maybe make a quick side note. Early on in his Metaphysics, he gives us most of the information that we have for the Pre-Socratics, and it wouldn't be that much reading, like the first 6 chapters of it or whatever, probably like 20 minutes worth of reading. He's our major source for a lot of the information we have on the Pre-Socratics. That would be his Metaphysics. So if you wanted to get straight to the source that most people are using for their arguments about what these Pre-Socratics said, his Metaphysics would be a good place to start. Okay, so now we'll move into all things have soul in them. And here what he means by soul is some sort of moving principle, something that animates. And like Louis said, Louis? Mm-hmm. Okay, not Stafford. Okay. Anyways, one of the phenomena that I already knew about this time was magnets. So obviously animals have soul in them, some animating principle, some moving principle. Animals can pretty much do whatever they want. In fact, the anima that we use for animals, the animating principle, is very much related to the Greek word for soul. But he also noticed things like magnets. Magnets can make other things move towards them. And another thing that they knew about early on is if you take a fur, like a cat fur, and you take amber and you rub them together, you produce charges. And so then you'll have one actually positively charged and one negatively charged. And the Greeks knew about this phenomenon, and this was very fascinating to them because it seems like these two things that weren't moving in any way, you could somehow stimulate in them the ability to start moving now. So they must have always had that innate ability to attract things and move away from things. They must have always had this moving principle within them, and yet there's just some way to get them to manifest it. Now we know today that as they're rubbing those two things together, electrons are moving from one object to the other, actually charging them. But obviously the Greeks have no idea that charges are shifting around or anything like that. They just have two things, they're not attracting anything. You rub them together, they start attracting stuff. It's the craziest thing. And you can also use magnets to align other magnetic material to also start being magnetic. So you got a rock that's a magnetic material, but it's not a magnet yet. You can use a strong enough magnet to force it to start acting more magnetic. So there seems to be ways to make things that don't have any moving principle in them, meaning they cause other things to move and move themselves, to suddenly have them. So Thales thought everything must have a moving principle in it, a soul in it. So Thales seems also, from what they say, to have supposed that soul was something moving if he said that the stone possessed soul because it moves iron. So this, they assume, is talking about a magnet. I'm guessing that came from Aristotle since I didn't put a source on there. And then we already talked about how the reason that he speculated this was observing magnets. And some say that soul pervades everything, from which reason perhaps Thales thought that all things are full of gods. Now, to Leah's point, because this is also where we're going to talk about the all is divine. I don't think we go any further than that. You said, what did he mean by the all is divine? My answer is, I don't have a clue. The author tries to make some weird connection about, he's talking about the nature of things, the life of things, and the divinity of things. And the quote we have is that all things have gods in them as well. So not only all things have souls, but all things seem to have gods in them as well. I have no clue what he meant by this. All I can tell you is that he's supposed to have said it. And you can read the author's argument for how he's trying to connect these three things to somehow trying to make some sense out of it. I didn't find it at all persuasive, and so I'm not going to pretend that I understood something that I'm going to teach you about it. So, I don't have a clue. You're better off just reading what the author has to say about that one and take it from him. Because, yeah, I couldn't make sense of it. Okay, so Thales. We come across him. At first, his philosophy appears a bit unimpressive. Now, the answers he gives to his questions are what are unimpressive. The amazing thing is that he is asking these questions. That's what's so crucial. That's why we say Thales was the first. He's trying to ask questions and look for answers in the right way. He's trying to explain things in terms of natural phenomena as far as philosophy is concerned. He also was the first to start doing proofs close to how we think about proofs. So that's why he's considered the father of mathematics. And then the fact that all his philosophy happens to fall into the realm of science is also why he's called the first scientist. So he introduced the idea that natural laws govern, and that phenomena can be explained by reference to a logical reality. And one example is, since everything's water, he also thought the earth, well, this comes from the fact that he lived in Melitus. And so if you dig down deep enough in the ground, you're digging a well. If you keep digging, you hit water. So he thought that the earth was actually just on top of water. So his notion of the earth, I don't know what he thought big picture about what it looked like, but he thought the earth was floating on top of water. And like Louis said, that earthquakes are what happens when the earth rocks on waves. That's what causes earthquakes. So terrible answer, wonderful question. It's no longer earthquakes are because God is mad. Earthquakes are because the earth is floating on water and it rocks. Terrible answer. Great that he's questioning and trying to give a rational explanation for why they happen. So, probably good to end it there with Thales. Those of you who want credit, stay after. Let's have a conversation, and we need to have a conversation about how we're doing these papers going forward.
Yeah.
Hey, Donnie, quick question. Just remind me, all this information we just went over with Thales, were you saying that this was through the dark period of the Greeks and it was mostly word of mouth?
Sorry. No, I should have specified that gap better. So let's go here. So the dark period starts roughly 1100 BC, ends roughly 800 to 700 BC.
Okay.
And by the time we got Thales, we are for sure out of that period.
So this was all written down. This information we just went over was all written down, documented somehow.
So it's not known whether or not Thales actually wrote any works down. But his immediate student, the first student that we have for sure, started writing down his actual arguments, ideas, positions. And even though none of them are extant, we know that he at least was writing them down.
Okay.
So Thales, maybe he did, maybe he didn't, but someone who was very close to him for sure did, and for sure understood everything that Thales had to say.
Okay. Thanks.
Any other questions? Okay, wonderful. That's all I have for you. We'll pick it up from there next. Oh, go ahead.
Can you email the slides to us?
I can email them to you if you want, but I don't have them all done, so they're going to change. So if you want up to date, you'd have to keep asking. I wonder if I could just share it with all of you. That seems harder. If you want it emailed, text me. That's the easiest way. And then that way, when I open my phone and see that text, I'll think, okay, I need to remember to email to him. So yes, I'll email you the slides if you want them. Understand that they're completely incomplete. I'm going to be building these as we go, trying to stay a couple weeks ahead. But yeah, I'm happy to send anyone who cares the slides. Any other questions?
When's our next class? It's next Monday, I think it's Labor Day.
Monday?
Memorial Day.
Or Memorial Day, sorry.
Unless the majority of you take issue with that, I'm fine to keep doing it. I mean, no better way to party. Let's do a quick vote. Who wants to have class that day? Who doesn't? Sorry, Mom, you're outvoted. I counted your vote twice since you're my mom. It just wasn't enough.
Fine, you guys party without me.
Yeah, hopefully this shows up pretty well and you can follow everything just fine online. It looks pretty good here. Maybe that's just because we're looking at a map and the slides are worse. I don't know. Anything else? Okay, I'll see you all next week, and those of you doing credit, stay by. One more thing, for any of those of you who aren't trying to get credit for this class, but for some reason want to do the assignments, that's perfectly fine. Just in case you're a little weird.